Joining us now on The Debate, Richard Gwynne, veteran columnist for the Toronto Star and the author of the 1995 book, Nationalism Without Walls, The Unbearable Lightness of Being Canadian. Best title ever. Sylvia Bashevkin, principal at University College, U of T, and Roberto Martella, proprietor of Grano Restaurant and a member of the board of the Toronto Arts Festival, Luminato. Nice to have you three alongside as well. You've heard my interview with Ken, and I want to start, Richard, with you with some further analysis. Do you believe that we won't be the better country that he wants us to be unless this better understanding of ourselves and our kind of national narrative improves? Is that true?
I think Ken Dryden is absolutely right. I mean, he's right in his starting point, which is that politics has so far played a pretty minor role in the development of Canada. You can go all the way back to the start of the last century, the social gospel movement, that kind of thing. But much of the time, it's been a manager and an administrator and that kind of thing, which is fine, but it doesn't stir the spirit or touch the soul. And there is, I think Ken is absolutely right, that there are some very important developments. I would cite one he even mentioned in the book, but the Olympics in Vancouver. I mean, there was an extraordinary spirit of that, and for Canadians to say, we're going to own the podium, is about as un-Canadian as you can get, is about as un-self-deprecating as you could possibly get, because you are taking a terrible risk that you're about to be humiliated. And for a week, remember, we looked as though we were going to be humiliated, and then things turned around. So sometimes it works, sometimes the magic doesn't. And that spirit, that sense that there's something special about Canada. And again, I think Ken, you didn't quote this, but I think it's a very important quote in his book, where he says that if the global world doesn't work in Canada, which is a global country, I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty close, then basically, you know, we're all in real trouble. That if all people getting together and living together and being something bigger than just the whole of their little individual selves and their little ethnicities, if it doesn't work here, it ain't going to work anywhere. But we're in a world where that has to work, because we're all bumping against each other.
If we can't do it, it can't be done.
Can't be done. We have a best shot at it. How we got into this, nobody really knows, because it was never discussed nationally. It sort of happened.
But here we are.
But here we are. We are a multicultural country with a huge immigration program by anybody else's standards, the biggest in the world, you know, proportionate to our size. And we're taking a great risk, and so far it's working. And this is very un-Canadian.
Sylvia, what do you say?
I think Ken has the core argument about the need for a narrative that draws us together. I think I would push him a little bit and say there have to probably be multiple narratives, given exactly what Richard's talked about here, the variety, the geographic diversity that made us a federal country in the first place, and the linguistic variety that made us a federal country in the first place. But all of the immigration that we know per capita is the highest in the world. And just the fact we have large urban-rural differences. We have large generational differences, particularly with an aging society. So Ken refers to how younger and older Canadians see the country somewhat differently from time to time. But I think I would push him particularly on what progressive political parties have to tell us in the way of a narrative that permits us to actually believe that there's an alternative to what he's very critical of here, which is the Stephen Harper approach that says cutting taxes is the right thing to do, small government is the right thing to do. I would push him on the need for a progressive narrative and how that is going to draw Canadians together, because those of us who've just seen, for example, the mayoral elections in Toronto can see that the counter-narrative needs to be more compelling.
Okay, she's pushing. You want to push back?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, that's it is that other story, and I think that what I try to do in the book is essentially, one is that the biggest narrative I think that we have, and it's what we were talking about and what Richard was mentioning, is in terms of that remarkable experiment that is us, and in a global world, us as that best example of it. I think that's where we begin in it. But what I'm trying to do with this book is essentially say, well, if this is us, then for each of us as individuals and in our tasks and in our professional lives and in universities is that what would this Canada do? How would this Canada think? How would we approach And it can be anything: agricultural policy, our role in the world, the buying of F-35s, or whatever it happens to be. What would this Canada do in each of those areas? And the whole idea of this book is to generate that kind of conversation, and to try to get people, is that, okay, if we accept the fact that this is this Canada, let's start thinking in those terms, and you know your particular subject area better than I do, and let's start those kinds of conversations and really push each other in that way.
We know one thing, that half the people who live in the capital city of Ontario were not born here. And here's one of them. Okay, Senor Metelo, what do you have to say?
Well, I mean, I like the title "Becoming Canada." I question the dedication when it talked about our ancestors, because I think many of us have different ancestors. Ken admits that all these ancestors will, and the current crop of Canadians, citizens and not, because there are many Canadians who are not yet citizens, will become the new Canada. But I think we need, I mean, we're almost a little late. We're kind of post-nation state, and I don't know that we need a specific identity. We're never going to have the identity and the culture that Quebec has, because we have very, very different pasts, a language that we share with our neighbors to the south. Whereas Quebec, their language is almost sui generis. It was shielded from, because of the church and because of the French Revolution, from the original language in France. So I think we need to identify almost some touchstones to guarantee that we all become bona fide Canadians. For me, it's shocking, in light of our 150th anniversary, we're virtually on the eve of the 150th in 2017, that the country isn't more functionally bilingual than it is. Thousands of kids in major cities across the country, not just Toronto, attend French immersion. And I think there's a real goodwill where bilingualism is concerned, both in the ROC, the rest of Canada, and in Quebec. But I think this should be one thing we should say as a kind of a sesquicentennial project. We should become more bilingual, more multilingual.
I think most people are, Roberto. It just may not be English and French.
Well, let's then capitalize on that fact as well, and let's encourage a multilingualism as well, given the NAT, given our ability to leverage these links with the rest of the world for trade, etc.
Richard.
Can I say a word in defense of the old Canada, which of course is vanishing as we, every day? The Canada that is multicultural came out of the old Canada. The old Canada decided to accept it.
Meaning what? French and English Canada? And that
well, simply described. I mean, we're geographically separated, we're linguistically separated. We're at least three nations. We never were one nation. We were always French, English, and Aboriginal, for instance. And most nation states are homogeneous. That's why they are nation states. They're not nations states. And the old Canada, which is conservative and it's small c and cautious, pulled off one of the great achievements of this country. We have the world's most boring banks. They don't go bankrupt. That is very Canadian. So we're the country that bought bilingualism and are implementing it. That's the old Canada. The other people have come in and they're making contributions, but the fact that it happened here is not a coincidence. It happened here, not in the North Pole or not in Germany or any other place. It happened here, and you have to say, why did it happen here and not somewhere else?
Ken.
And I think, as Richard is talking about, that old Canada that is so often described in news articles and in magazines from elsewhere as being polite and nice and respectful and clean, and all of those things that I think they thought that as I heard them, that I would feel great about it. I always felt a little embarrassed by. But as Richard said, it is absolutely out of that Canada that you can have the kind of multicultural evolving that we have. I mean, it is only if you are willing to be respectful of somebody who's different, polite to somebody who is different, nice to somebody who is different, patient, etc., etc. That's the only way that you're going to be able to find a way of living with difference. It is absolutely out of that old Canada that this new Canada has had its chance.
Well, let me push, Sylvia wanted to push a bit before. I want to push a bit on this we that you keep talking about. Because, you know, where you stand obviously depends on where you sit. And if you say we to somebody in Quebec, you know, that's two founding peoples. And they're half the country and we're half the country. If you say we to somebody who perhaps got here, you know, from Somalia 5 years ago, we may have a different meaning. So when you say we, what do you mean?
I think what I'm trying to say is just the we that each of us sees around us, you know, in the present day. Not to really try to find an identity or an answer in the past, but literally just look around us. And I mean, all of us have had the experience of being in a crowd, looking out into a crowd and thinking, oh my God, that is unbelievable. Look at all of those faces. Look at the colors of those faces. Look at what they're all wearing. That is not possible, but it's there. I mean, that's what we have, you know, in this country. And so I think in fact where you know that we, as I said earlier, we are not so preoccupied by difference. One of the things I say in the book, I mean, 10 or 15 years ago when I would walk down the street or watch others walk down the street, we'd be doing double takes all the time. See some, gee, what was that? Now, you know, when was the last time you've done a double take? You know, we've seen it all before. The differences just matter less. We're giving others much more of a chance than other countries are.
Sylvia.
But I think, Ken, to your credit in the book, you note, for example, that professionally educated immigrants to Canada are not able to earn what Canadians with similar qualifications are earning. We know we have residential and housing segregation in our major cities. We know that there's a lot of difficulties with our own self-constructed sense of Canadian identity. I was struck, I had a research trip to Helsinki where there was an art exhibition where each country in the world was represented by a bear. And I walked around to try and identify the Canadian bear in the crowd. I was unable to, so I did another walkthrough, and I realized that the Canadian bear was a mosaic of different little tiles, all of different colors. It wasn't hockey, it wasn't the maple leaf, it wasn't red and white, it was just a mosaic that this Finnish artist had constructed of what to them Canada was. So I remember asking people during the week I was there, and what is Canada? Where does this come from? And they said, well, you know, when we visit Canada, there's no sense of who you are. It's just all these different varieties in a mosaic. It's all about the celebration of difference. And so one of the questions is the extent to which you can have the cohesion in light of the tolerance and so on. And I think that's one of the questions that the book raises.
But what I would argue with that is that is an outsiders to Canada. I mean, when they would come to Canada, they would see all of those differences and be totally struck by all of those differences and put themselves back in their own countries and say, that is not possible. That will not work. Even with many fewer pieces to that mosaic in my own home country, it doesn't work. So when they would come here, all they would do is see the variety of those differences. We're not quite there. We see those differences a whole lot less than the outsider to Canada does. That's the only way in which we can make difference work.
If you visit Toronto from a small Canadian community, it is quite striking.
That is true. Roberto.
I think there's also a duality that we have as Canadians, not French, English, but our best man, who, speaking about art, is an award-winning artist who lives on an island off the north coast of Japan. And he was shortlisted for Governor General's Award, so he's a real, let's call him a dyed-in-the-hockey-pan Canadian, if I could. And he loves Canada, and he keeps in touch with Canada on the net, etc. And he says we come across as being smug. Canadians come across as being smug. That's the one part of the duality. The other is that there is this insecurity we have. And I sense that there's almost this insidious attempt to recreate Canada through the rear view mirror. That in spite of the fact that, you know, Ken mentions Germany, France, Italy is a very multicultural country now because a very, very low birth rate. In Italy, which was a country of emigration, is now a country of immigration. But we want to try to shoehorn the old Canada not Richard's old Canada, because Richard's is a very evolved old Canada, but the Canada which perhaps never existed, that we want people who come here to embrace so-called Canadian values, rather than, as your book suggests and the title suggests, let's recreate constantly these new Canadian values, whatever they might be, no prescription whatsoever. But fedora-clad middle-aged people like me who think that the times were greater then, expect people to come here and embrace Vimy Ridge and everything else that's Canadian, and not contribute to the new Canadian identity.
Richard.
Can I make a comment about this what you might call this hyper multiplicity that is Canada, and this mosaic bear, that sort of, I think, perhaps upset you. It can't work. I know, it can't work, what we're trying to do, except Canadians can make it work, or may be able to. It's unworkable. I mean, we are going to be so diverse, we won't be a community. That's obvious.
Cohesion.
There won't be any cohesion. And yet, I think we're going to make it work. And by the way, it is not unimportant that while we have had failures, and there are, of course, immigrants who have qualifications, or who perhaps their qualifications really aren't the same, but anyway, certainly on paper are the same, and who can't get the jobs they should be. There are problems of all kinds. We haven't had any riots. In all kinds of wonderful countries like Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, they've had riots.
Well, I'm going to push back on you a little bit because, 40 years ago we did have riots. It was called the FLQ, and it happened in Quebec.
No,
and
I
I do
was
want
talking about ethnic riots.
I appreciate that, but
That was old-fashioned nationalism.
but I want to return to the Quebec angle here because I guess some could criticize the Dryden book for saying it's a great vision for English Canada, but the majority of Quebecers who send 47 BQ members to Parliament won't sign on to that. They won't. They can't.
No,
Do you think so?
They won't sign on.
They won't
No,
and can't.
No, they won't.
What do you say on that? You spent a lot of time in Montreal. What do you think?
No, I mean, I think, and I've tested it out a few times in Quebec in the last couple of months, and again, not knowing, but a lot of this book also emerged out of the fact of remembering two referendums of 1980 and 1995, and remembering the Canada story that we were selling in Quebec, which was a Canada story of you don't want to lose the Rockies, and what would happen to your economy tomorrow if there was separation, and what about your share of the national debt and all the rest of it. That was the Canada story. That is not a winning story, ultimately. And I think any of us in the rest of Canada who were listening to the telling of that story were saying, there's a whole lot more to Canada than that. I mean, that's not just the Canada story. So what is that larger story? What I would argue, and what I've been trying to suggest here, is that what I'm laying out is very much the experience in Quebec, as well, in terms of variety, diversity, differences, and the reason why it has worked as well as it has in Quebec as well is because of Quebec's historic experience with the rest of Canada, the French English as well as the English French, and that that if we don't have that kind of compelling larger story, there are that in terms of the future in Quebec, that's tough.
Roberto?
Well, let's speak about Quebec for a moment. I mean, on the one hand, it's admirable that a large number of Quebecois have their representatives in federal parliament under the Bloc Québécois banner. But it's shocking that they should have been there for so long, some of them collecting pensions, I suspect as well. What is it about the rest of us that we haven't been able to appeal to them through various federal parties that we have and get them to vote for the vision that is Canada, or the Canada? I mean, who was it, Montesquieu or something? Le cœur a des raisons que raison connaît pas. The heart has reasons which reason does not understand. What is our heart, our Canadian heart, that should appeal to the majority of Quebecois to vote for a national party that serves us from sea to sea to sea?
We haven't made the sale yet, Sylvia, have we?
No, we certainly haven't made it. We certainly haven't closed it. And we've also, I think, forgotten, to go back to Roberto's point about smugness, we've forgotten the fact that there are many other countries which are immigrant-receiving countries right now approaching us on a per capita basis. The smaller Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, whatever, have had quite strong economies of late, and the research shows, that the mobility, upward mobility of immigrants and their children is more rapid in many of those countries than in the US or Canada right now. So we're going to have to make more of a case if we're going to continue to be a very healthy and diverse immigrant receiving country against more competition in light of this division that Roberto speaks of.
And I think that's exactly right, and it goes back to your point earlier about, you know, a lot of very talented immigrants coming here and not having the chance to do what they have been trained to do. But it goes back to the point that I was trying to make earlier, is that if we think of ourselves as this kind of Canada, what would this Canada do in terms of those who are immigrants to the country now? If in fact it's not, as one would understand 50 or 80 or 100 years ago, where immigrants just kind of land, find a way of, you know, making things for themselves through their generation, get their kids in school and hope their kids, you know, will make it in the next generation, and then everything is fine down the line. If things need to speed up, if in fact those immigrants coming here are more trained and more educated than the previous ones, what would this Canada do in terms of integrating them, involving them in the rest? And I think, as you said, it is more than what we are doing now. But that emanates out of that argument of you know, the bigger sense of ourselves is what will end up changing our policy in terms of the immigrant, as opposed to just trying to change the policy on its own.
Richard.
I think our appeal, and this is, I understand it, is what Ken is advancing as a nation to immigrants, is this is a place where excellent things are starting to happen. And this is very un-Canadian. We never went for excellence. We were scared of excellence because you know, you fall flat in your face every now and then. And then let me give you some examples of excellence. I mentioned one, you know, the Olympics, but it was extraordinary. I mean, it was so beautifully done. It was beautifully, I'm not talking about the winning, that was nice, but the whole Olympics was done beautifully. In Waterloo, there's a thing called the Perimeter Institute. And it's extraordinary. I mean, here is an attempt to create a leading research institution in physics. And none of us would understand...
Theoretical physics.
Theoretical
Theoretically.
physics, that's
None of us
Exactly,
would
not
understand...
just applied industry-interested physics.
You're quite right.
Theoretical, yeah.
But you know, none of us in this table would be able to understand two words that they talked about. But this is marvelous that we would dare... And I'll give a last example. The Munk debates, you know, which take place in this thing. And there was a debate. Unfortunately, it wasn't a good debate because Tony Blair was put on a poor performance. The other person was Christopher Hitchens, about whether religion was a net good or a net bad. That was what, I hate to hear myself use the phrase, but it was a world-class occasion. And that was picked up by the BBC and shown around the world. That's not Canada. That is not what we've thought of, at least when we were young, as being Canadian, not the world. But these things are happening here. People are daring to do the excellent and the extraordinary.
Having said that, let me pick up on one of the angles in Ken's book, which is this. He suggests we may not have the institutions in place, both in terms of politics and in terms of media, to enable the country to have the conversation that we're having today around this table here. Roberto, is that true?
Well, I think we have the institutions, we perhaps don't celebrate them enough. I mean, for example, this year would have been the 100th birthday of Marshall McLuhan in July of this year. And so, you know, if we think one of his edicts, the medium is the message, in some ways our country is the medium, and the message is the message of how great we are, how tolerant we are, how do we share this, but not just glibly and smugly, but in challenging. So the notion of, as I say, bilingualism, multilingualism, learning more about the world, leveraging our internationalism at the world, on the world stage. I mean, we love nothing more than to refer to things like the Munk debates and the Canadarm. We perhaps are the only people in the world who call it the Canadarm, but we like having success abroad. Millions of Canadians were gathered around the television sets recently when the juniors were playing in the championship, the hockey. So we want to share this internationalism, and I think we do have the institutions, but we need to challenge ourselves to use those institutions.
Have our politics become too small-minded? Pinched is a word you use frequently. Have they become too pinched that we are missing the bigger story here because we're constantly fighting over small, insignificant things?
Well, I think the fact that we have had a succession of minority parliaments federally has probably led to more of that sort of small-scale tactical maneuvering, very little of big strategic thinking. But I think we're also dealing with 19th century institutions, particularly in terms of the treatment of our cities. right? If our cities are the destination of most of our immigrants are the source of our demographic growth for the most part. If more than half the immigrants to Canada arrive in the Greater Toronto Area, and we're dealing with a city that has very little in the way of fiscal autonomy, I mean, I think, playing catch up with our institutions. Our institutions don't look like that inside of the subway or the large crowds that you talked about, Ken. So there is a lack, I think, of the demographic mirroring we expect in a dynamic society. So while I think Roberto's right, we've accomplished a lot, we have more work.
Ken.
I mean, I think part of the problem is that you don't change your institutions by just saying, let's change our institutions and changing this part or that part. I think that our institutions end up changing when we have a reason to change them. I mean, for instance, you were talking about the cities. I mean, as you mentioned, I mean that the cities are the destination and the residence of most Canadians, and the future is going to be so much there as well. Well, in this Canada, how would one, in fact, how would our institutions function? Would they function in the same way, where the cities are sort of an afterthought government in terms of authority, or in this Canada? Would in fact it be different? Now, if we just have a debate over, well, the federal government, that's their jurisdiction, and the provincial government and the local governments, and it's a jurisdictional debate, we'll get nowhere, just as we've gotten nowhere for the last 50 years or so. But if there's a different context in which to have that discussion, then it starts to come alive again.
Richard.
I think we are underestimating the importance of the institution that we have, which is Parliament and the government. Those are the central issues, central institutions in the country, and others flow from them. I mean, obviously also from the provinces. And this comes back to Stephen Harper. And he's taken some knocks in your book and in some of the comments around this table. But you'd have to add, which I say with reluctance, but I think it's true, I think he does represent the feelings of a great many Canadians.
In what respect?
In his conservatism, in the fact that he doesn't believe in dreams and visions. He's not bold. He wants a nice, tidy ship that will eventually give him a majority, and then he will have done what I think his life object is to make the Conservatives into the default party, the natural governing party, the party that usually wins elections and every then screws up and gets heaved out so that they can, as the Liberals were for over a century. I think that's his main objective, not a hidden agenda. That's my own guess. And it's a very unambitious objective, except in narrow political terms, to say the Conservatives are now the principal party and the Liberals are the secondary party.
Narrow objective, but you think he may be in the tenor of the times,
He's in the tenor of the times, because while I deliberately threw out some areas where we are, reaching for excellence, obviously, and you discussed this in the interview, these are troubled times. These are times where people are not prepared to put their head over the pulpit. They want a job. They want those kind of things. They want security. That's perfectly understandable. And I think there are other factors as well. That the mood of the country is conservative, including because of many immigrants are conservative. They come from a background where they don't depend on the government to look after them. They don't trust the government at all. So the mood of the country is becoming increasingly conservative. That's no question, no one denying that.
Yeah, I tend to disagree. Surely maybe amongst the chattering class or the literati, there's a bit of conservatism. But as Ken alluded to about treading water, sure, once you're treading water, you're always, what do I do once I get on dry land or once I get out of this body of water? And I think the dreams and the visions that many Canadians share, perhaps unarticulated in some way, it behooves our leaders, our political leaders, to identify those, perhaps even to inform them and to extend them. But
is there a political leader that's doing that today in this country?
Well, I'm a big fan of Michael Ignatieff because he is someone, he's our rim, he's our Canadarm. He's someone who's distinguished himself and distinguished the Canadian message abroad, vilified for it somewhat amongst the uninformed for some reason. I mean, we love when we are recognized abroad. We love when we punch above our weight. But I think there are dreams and visions that we have that that speak more to Canada's role as a peacekeeper, Canada's role as an example to the world, showing this how this wonderful diversity, let's not call it multicultural, but let's call it diversity, that in a way is much more present in the world. I mean, when my family came post-war, one wasn't able to keep in touch with Italy as much as immigrants are now able to keep in touch with their countries by plane, by internet, by telephone, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a strength, I think. It's not a weakness.
At the risk of taking this conversation for 5 seconds into a partisan area, which we've managed to avoid so far pretty well, he hasn't made that sale with the rest of Canada yet, has he, Mr.
No,
Ignatieff?
and this is something that time will tell whether he's able to do
Indeed.
that.
You wanted to say.
Just in terms of Richard's point, and I'm not sure that we are in a kind of a more small c conservative mindset. I think that in the absence of something else, then I think that they're having that mindset is having a good time these days. I think that if you just went south of the border and went back 2 years' time, I mean, I think that the appeal of Obama was very much one of a bigger sense of a return to America, the America of the imagination, the America that was inside the bones of Americans, and that larger self. And I think that's what really appealed to the public at that time.
Lasted less than a year.
Well, I don't think that the vision lasted less than a year. I think that his implementation of it lasted less than a year. I think what Obama did is forgot that his appeal, was to that, the visceral feeling that Americans had about America, and he just kept talking, specific issues, and then talking specific issues, he sounded like everybody else.
But the call to something bigger than ourselves.
But something
look
bigger,
at what
I
they were
think,
coming
is
out of, right? They were coming out of years and years of George W. Bush, right? I mean, we had, to be fair, under Paul Martin, I think, a fair bit of rhetoric that was soaring.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not talking
yeah.
about his governing abilities, but in terms of the rhetoric, we did have a period as Canadians where we could think about dreaming and bigger ideas. And I think it is important, perhaps, to think about election campaigns as opportunities where opposition leaders generally are able to soar. It's very hard, it seems to me, to soar in a minority parliament. And I think it's difficult for all party leaders, particularly for the Prime Minister included, because of the constraints. But yet we do have that opportunity. I think Ken makes a great case for how Michael Ignatieff could soar.
Less than 2 minutes.
I just wanted to add that there's one other element which is moving us in a conservative direction, which is, I think, which is people, I think, are weary of government. Government did wonderfully well after the Second World War, instituted the welfare state, gave people a whole lot of programs that were enormously valuable. Basically, the bureaucracy of all bureaucracies are suffering from hardening of the arteries, badly. And, people are just weary of dealing with bureaucracy and government, and they don't expect government to solve their problems in the way they used to.
In which case, in our last minute here, Ken, if there is a new story of the country being written, what do you want the people watching this program to do about it?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's part of why I wrote the book, was to try to start a conversation. I mean, in part, it's and these are the non-answers to get out quick. I mean, there's becoming Canada on Facebook, on Twitter. I mean, but what we need more than anything, I think, is the desire to have the conversation, and of realizing that is a big part of what is missing. And as I say in the book, I don't think that so many of the people at home are frustrated with politics and have turned away from politics. But I don't think our politics are going to change unless we have our larger discussions, larger conversations, because the vast majority of Canadians are not interested in the small p politics. They might just be compelled by the larger conversations, in it. And so it's to push, it's to be demanding, it's to push us, it's also to push the media. I mean, the media rewards us in the wrong way, and we reward the media in the wrong way. We bring out the absolute worst in each other. We are not all, that there are some smart people in Parliament, there are some smart people in media, and we need to push at the best in each other, You know, we need the best in each other, or else it's just more sniping.
The name of the book is Becoming Canada, Our Story, Our Politics, Our Future. I want to thank our participants on the other side of the table for joining us today. Sylvia Bashevkin in the middle, the principal from UC, flanked by Roberto Martella from down the street at Grano and Luminato. Richard Gwynne, Nationalism Without Walls. You'll read him in the Toronto Star. Thanks so much to you three, and of course to Ken Dryden, MP for York Centre. Great to have you back here at TVO, Ken. Thank you.